She sat at the Duke's table draped in blood-red silk, seconds away from securing his unimaginable fortune. She thought she had won. Then, the Dowager Duchess raised her silver cane and smashed the black obsidian pendant on the girl's chest. The illusion violently shattered. Duke James watched in horror as the mysterious Countess melted away, leaving only the mud-soaked, bankrupt bride he had abandoned at the altar 6 months ago. The heavy doors locked from the outside. The Duke slowly stood up. "Welcome to Luna's secret library. Sometimes the most unexpected turns lead us exactly where we need to be. What happens next is something I never saw coming, and I think you'll find it just as surprising. Stick around for the conclusion. It's a reminder that it's never too late for a new chapter. If you enjoy discovering these hidden gems, I'd be honored to have you follow for more." The rain battered the cobblestone courtyard of the grand estate. Dowager Duchess Eleanor adjusted the scratchy wool of her borrowed servant's cloak. She had ruled the vast territories of the Sterling family for 3 decades with an iron will. Today, however, she looked like nothing more than an aging scullery maid seeking shelter. Her son, Duke James, possessed a tall, athletic build and a heart far too trusting for his own good. He was utterly captivated by his new bride-to-be. The young woman was undeniably breathtaking. Her name was Chloe, a girl with spun gold hair and eyes like polished sapphires. Yet, rumors from the neighboring provinces whispered of a rotten core hidden beneath that flawless exterior. Eleanor had not survived the deadly politics of the High Court by trusting mere rumors. She needed to see the truth with her own eyes. Slipping through the heavy oak doors of the servants' entrance, she stepped into the bustling kitchen corridors. The estate was in a frenzy of preparation for the wedding of the century. Servants darted past her, their arms laden with silver trays and exotic blooms. No one spared a second glance for the older woman in the stained, coarse garments. This invisibility was exactly what the Duchess required. She navigated the labyrinthine halls, making her way toward the grand drawing room. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn back, revealing a room bathed in the golden glow of crystal chandeliers. There stood Chloe, draped in a gown of imported silk that cost more than a village earned in a year. The young beauty was barking orders at a trembling housemaid. "You clumsy, worthless little rat." Chloe's voice cracked like a master's whip across the opulent room. The maid fell to her knees, frantically trying to sponge a tiny drop of tea from the imported rug. Eleanor paused in the shadow of the doorway, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Chloe kicked the maid's scrub bucket, sending filthy water spilling across the polished floorboards. "I will be the Duchess of Sterling by tomorrow," the beautiful girl sneered. "Once that ring is on my finger, I will fire every last one of you incompetent fools." Eleanor took a slow, deliberate breath to steady the rising fury in her chest. She stepped out of the shadows, deliberately dragging her worn boots against the wood. Chloe spun around, her beautiful face twisting into a mask of pure disgust. "Who let this filthy beggar into my private parlor?" she demanded. Eleanor kept her head bowed, playing the part of a terrified old servant. "I apologize, my lady," Eleanor rasped, altering her normally commanding tone into a subservient croak. "I was sent to clean the hearth ashes before the Duke returns." Chloe let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed terribly in the grand space. "Look at you, covered in soot and smelling of cheap cabbage." The young bride circled Eleanor like a predator inspecting a particularly unappetizing meal. "This is exactly the kind of wretched filth I will purge from this estate." Eleanor kept her gaze fixed firmly on the floorboards. "The Duke has always been kind to the elderly staff, miss," she ventured softly. Chloe rolled her sapphire eyes and scoffed loudly. "James is a muscle-bound idiot who cares too much about peasants." Eleanor's jaw tightened at the casual insult thrown at her beloved son. "His pathetic bleeding heart makes him incredibly easy to manipulate," Chloe continued. She boasted to an empty room and an old maid, utterly unaware of her true audience. He thinks I love him for his poetry and his noble soul. She admired her flawless reflection in a gilded mirror, adjusting a diamond hairpin. I am marrying him for the sterling vaults, the endless estates, and the absolute power. Eleanor slowly lifted her head, letting a fraction of her true, piercing gaze meet the girl's reflection. And what of the Dowager Duchess? Eleanor asked. Her voice dropped an octave closer to its natural, terrifying resonance. Chloe burst into a cruel, triumphant fit of giggles. That old hag is currently rotting away in the northern keep, miles from here. The beautiful girl turned back to Eleanor, her eyes flashing with pure malice. Once the vows are spoken, I will cut off her allowance and banish her to a draughty convent. Eleanor did not flinch, though the temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. You seem very confident in your plans, my lady, Eleanor said quietly. Chloe snatched a heavy crystal goblet from the table and stepped directly into Eleanor's personal space. I am flawless, I am young, and I have the Duke wrapped completely around my finger. Without warning, Chloe tilted the goblet and poured the remnants of cold wine directly over Eleanor's worn shoes. Now get on your hands and knees and scrub this floor, you pathetic old witch. Eleanor looked down at her ruined shoes, and then up into the cruel, beautiful face of her son's impending doom. A slow, terrifyingly calm smile spread across the older woman's lips. It was the exact smile that had preceded the fall of 3 rival houses during her reign. As you wish, my lady, Eleanor whispered, turning to leave. She walked down the silent corridor, the cold wine soaking through her thin socks. She did not care about the physical discomfort. Her mind was already calculating the precise moment of execution. James deserved a partner who respected the legacy of their bloodline. He did not deserve a parasite draped in expensive lace. The trap was fully set. She had heard exactly what she needed to hear. All Chloe had to do now was walk down the aisle tomorrow and seal her own absolute destruction. The morning sun bled through the heavy velvet curtains of the bridal suite. Chloe stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror, a vision of pristine white lace and predatory ambition. She ran her fingers over the smooth surface of the sterling family heirloom tiara. The diamonds caught the light, shattering it into 1,000 tiny daggers against the walls. More height. I told you I wanted the hair higher. Chloe shrieked at the trembling stylist. The poor girl struggled to pin the heavy veil into place with shaking hands. Without a word, Chloe turned and delivered a stinging slap across the girl's cheek. If I look anything less than a goddess today, I will have you whipped in the public square. The room went deathly silent, the other maids keeping their heads low like beaten dogs. Chloe didn't care about their fear, in fact, she feasted on it. She felt like a queen who had finally ascended to her rightful throne. In her mind, the obstacle of the old hag Eleanor had already been cleared. The servants whispered that the Dowager Duchess had been missing since the previous evening. Chloe assumed the old woman had simply fled in terror after their little encounter in the parlor. Probably crawled back to her drafty northern keep like the coward she is, Chloe muttered. A sharp knock echoed against the oak door, and James stepped into the room. He looked every inch the noble Duke, his broad shoulders filling the space with masculine grace. His eyes softened the moment they landed on Chloe, filled with a terrifyingly pure devotion. You are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen, James whispered, kissing her gloved hand. Chloe forced a shy, virginal blush to creep up her cheeks with practiced ease. I only hope I can live up to the sterling name, my love, she lied, her voice like honeyed poison. James glanced around the room, a flicker of concern crossing his handsome features. Mother is still not here, he noted, his brow furrowing in confusion. The staff says she hasn't been seen since yesterday afternoon. Chloe leaned into his chest, her small hands resting on his medals of valor. Perhaps the excitement was too much for her fragile heart, James. She is old, after all, and change can be so frightening for the elderly. She watched his face, making sure he swallowed the lie without question. "I'm sure she's just resting," she added, her eyes gleaming with hidden triumph. James nodded slowly, though the unease remained etched into his jawline. "I suppose you're right. We must proceed. The bishop is waiting." As James led his bride toward the grand chapel, another transformation was occurring. In the deepest, most private wing of the manor, a heavy iron bolt slid back. Eleanor sat in a high-backed chair, her spine as straight as a military officer's. The grime of the scullery maid had been scrubbed away with scalding water and lemon oil. Her loyal old steward, Thomas, stood behind her, his hands steady as he brushed her silver hair. "The girl was more vicious than the rumors suggested, Thomas," Eleanor said. Her voice had returned to its natural state, the low, melodic hum that commanded instant obedience. "She is a viper in silk, my lady," Thomas replied softly. "She believes she has already won." Eleanor looked at the reflection in the glass, seeing the face of a woman who had survived wars. She reached out and touched the heavy silk of her royal purple gown. It was the garment she wore only for the most significant state occasions. Beside her, on a small silver pedestal, sat a pair of worn, stained servant's shoes. They were still damp with the wine Chloe had poured over them the night before. "Wrap these in the finest gold paper," Eleanor commanded, her eyes narrowing. "They are my official wedding gift to the new Duchess." Thomas bowed low, his face remaining a neutral mask, though his eyes sparkled. "The ceremony has begun, my lady. The guests are all seated." Eleanor rose from the chair, the heavy train of her dress rustling like the wings of a dark bird. She felt no pity for the girl, and only a deep, protective sorrow for her son's coming heartbreak. Better he bleed a little now than be drained dry for the rest of his life. She walked out of the room, her heels clicking with lethal precision on the marble floors. Every servant they passed stopped in their tracks, dropping into deep, frantic curtsies. The air in the hallway seemed to vibrate with the sheer force of her presence. She was no longer the invisible shadow, she was the storm. In the grand chapel, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfumes. The nobility of 3 provinces had gathered to witness the union of the Sterling line. Chloe stood at the altar, her veil obscuring the smirk she couldn't quite hide. James held her hands, his voice steady as he began to recite the ancient vows of his house. "If any man or woman can show just cause why these two may not be joined." The bishop droned. He paused for the customary silence, a mere formality that usually lasted 3 seconds. Suddenly, the massive double doors at the back of the chapel were hurled open. The booming sound echoed off the vaulted ceiling like a clap of thunder. The light from the courtyard flooded in, silhouetting a tall, regal figure. Chloe stiffened, her heart skipping a beat as she squinted through the glare. James let go of Chloe's hands, his eyes widening in shock and relief. "Mother," he breathed, his voice carrying through the silent, stunned congregation. Eleanor stepped into the light, her purple robes glowing like liquid amethyst. She carried a small, gold-wrapped box in her hands with the solemnity of a crown. Her gaze locked onto Chloe's, and for the first time, the young bride felt a chill of true terror. The face before her was not that of a fragile old woman. It was the face of the servant from the night before, now radiating a terrifying authority. "I believe the bride forgot something very important," Eleanor said. The silence in the room was so thick it felt like it could be cut with a sword. A debt of respect that must be paid before any ring touches that hand. Eleanor began to walk down the long aisle, her eyes never leaving Chloe's pale face. With every step, the carefully constructed world of Chloe's lies began to crumble. The scullery maid had come to collect her due, and the price would be everything. The silence in the grand chapel was absolute. Hundreds of noble guests held their collective breath. Eleanor moved with the fluid grace of a reigning monarch. Her heavy velvet train swept across the polished marble floor. Chloe shrank back against the stone altar. Her knuckles turned completely white as she gripped her expensive silk bouquet. She held the flowers in front of her chest as if they were a shield. James stepped forward to place himself between his mother and his bride. "Mother, where have you been?" he asked. His voice trembled slightly in the cavernous room. "We feared you had fallen ill before the ceremony." Eleanor stopped mere inches from her towering son. She looked up into his honest, bewildered face. "I was never ill, my beloved son." Her voice projected effortlessly to the farthest corners of the vaulted room. "I was merely conducting a necessary investigation into the future of our family." She held out the gold-wrapped box toward James. "I bring a wedding gift for the new Duchess of Sterling." James hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking the delicate package. Chloe's eyes darted frantically toward the heavy wooden exit doors. She knew exactly what was hidden inside that golden box. The memory of the cold wine splashing over the servant's boots flashed vividly in her mind. "James, do not open it," Chloe blurted out. Her carefully practiced voice cracked under the sudden panic. "It is a trick, a cruel jest to ruin our special day." James looked at his bride with a deep frown creasing his forehead. "Why would my mother play a trick on our wedding day?" He pulled the golden ribbon and let it fall to the floor. He slowly lifted the lid of the box. A collective gasp rippled through the front rows of the congregation. Inside sat a pair of worn, misshapen leather boots. They were stained a dark, ugly purple. The boots emitted the distinct, sour scent of cheap tavern wine. James stared at the ruined footwear in profound confusion. "These are the boots of a scullery maid," he stated softly. "Why are you giving garbage to my bride?" Eleanor turned her piercing gaze upon the trembling girl in white. "Because your bride has a distinct preference for how servants should be treated." Chloe shook her head wildly from side to side. Tears of genuine terror welled up in her sapphire eyes. "She is lying to you, James. I have never seen those foul things in my life." Eleanor did not raise her voice to match the girl's hysteria. Her tones simply cut through the air like polished steel. "Last night, I entered the grand parlor dressed in coarse wool. I wished to see the true nature of the woman claiming my son's heart." James looked back and forth between the two most important women in his world. "Mother, you dressed as a maid?" "I did," Eleanor confirmed. Her eyes never left Chloe's pale face. "And I received a very warm welcome from the future Duchess." She stepped around James to force Chloe to face her directly. "Tell him what you told the old scrubbing woman, Chloe." Chloe pressed her spine against the cold stone of the altar. "I said nothing," she screamed. The flawless mask of perfection was slipping rapidly. "You are a jealous old woman trying to steal my husband." A loud murmur of shock erupted from the gathered nobility. No one had ever dared to speak to the Dowager Duchess with such disrespect. Eleanor merely smiled a cold and terrifying smile. "You told me that my son was an idiot." James flinched backward as if struck by a physical blow. "You bragged that his bleeding heart made him easy to manipulate." The chapel grew deadly quiet once more. "You assured me that you were marrying him solely for the sterling vaults." Chloe covered her ears with her hands. Her chest heaved with rapid, panicked breaths. "Stop it. Stop making up these horrible lies to ruin me." James stared at the woman he loved. His entire world was fracturing before his eyes. "Mother, please," James whispered. His voice was breaking under the weight of the accusation. "She would never say such things." Eleanor reached calmly into the folds of her purple gown. "I do not rely on words alone, my son. I survived the High Court by always securing solid proof." She motioned her hand toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel. The loyal steward, Thomas, stepped forward into the light. He was not walking alone. Behind him stood 3 trembling housemaids in their simple uniforms. One of them was the girl Chloe had slapped in the bridal suite that very morning. A dark, undeniable bruise was already forming on the girl's cheek. Another was the maid whose bucket Chloe had viciously kicked in the parlor. Chloe's face drained of all remaining color. Her skin matched the stark white of her expensive gown. "These girls witnessed your bride's private behavior," Eleanor announced to the room. "They also heard every single word she spoke to the hidden Duchess last night." James dropped the golden box from his hands. The ruined shoes tumbled out onto the pristine marble floor. The dull thud echoed through the silent church like a judge's gavel. He looked at the bruised cheek of the maid standing nearest the door. Then he looked slowly back at the beautiful face of his bride. The illusion was finally shattering into a million pieces. "Chloe," James said. His voice dropped to a dangerous, unfamiliar register. "Did you pour wine on an elderly servant?" Chloe reached out to him with violently shaking hands. "James, you must understand, she was filthy. She had no right to be in my private parlor. It was a fatal, irreversible mistake." In her blind panic, she had just confessed to the encounter. The entire congregation gasped in perfect unison. James took a slow, deliberate step backward. He recoiled from her extended hands as if she were carrying a plague. "You treated a member of our household like an animal," he whispered. "A household you were meant to lead and protect." Chloe fell hard to her knees. She clutched desperately at the hem of his tailored jacket. "I was stressed. The wedding preparations have been an absolute nightmare for me. I didn't know it was your mother under those rags." Eleanor stepped forward to deliver the final, crushing blow. "That is the entire point, you foolish girl. You believed I was a nobody, and so you showed me your true soul." She looked down at the weeping bride with absolute, icy disgust. "You also mentioned your grand plan to banish me to a drafty convent." James closed his eyes tightly. A single tear escaped and rolled down his strong jawline. He had been a complete fool. He had been blinded by a pretty face and 1,000 sweet lies. He opened his eyes again. The gentle, forgiving lover was completely gone. Only the cold, resolute Duke of Stirling remained. He pulled his jacket free from her desperate, clawing grasp. "The ceremony is over," James declared. His voice rang with the absolute authority of his ancient bloodline. Chloe let out a piercing wail of pure agony. She collapsed entirely onto the cold marble floor. The ultimate prize had been ripped from her hands just seconds before she could claim it. The massive oak doors of the chapel slammed shut against the murmuring crowd. Only 4 people remained in the cavernous sanctuary. James stood motionless near the stone altar. Eleanor watched from the center of the main aisle. Thomas the steward waited quietly by the rear exit. Chloe remained on the cold marble floor. The tears vanished from her face with startling speed. The terrified weeping abruptly stopped entirely. She slowly pushed herself off the ground. She dusted off the knees of her imported silk gown. Her sapphire eyes hardened into chips of cold glass. She realized the marriage was truly lost. She immediately shifted to her backup plan. "You think you can just discard me?" Chloe asked. Her voice no longer held any trace of the sweet maiden. It was sharp and entirely pragmatic. A duke cannot break a formalized betrothal without consequence. James looked at her with utter disgust. "You broke the vow of honor the moment you abused my staff," he replied. Chloe laughed a dry, humorless sound. "Honor does not pay the merchants, James. We signed a legally binding betrothal contract last month. Section 4 clearly outlines a severance penalty if the groom withdraws." She took a step toward him. She raised her chin in blatant defiance. "You owe me 50,000 gold pieces. If you do not pay, I will go to the High Council. I will tell them you are a violent madman." I will swear that you beat me before the altar. I will ruin the sterling name across all 5 provinces. James clenched his fists tightly at his sides. He stepped forward to confront the extortion. Eleanor raised a single-gloved hand. James stopped instantly and stepped back. Eleanor walked slowly toward the defiant girl. You clearly mistake this family for a charity, Eleanor stated. You also vastly underestimate my preparation. Eleanor snapped her fingers once. Thomas stepped forward and handed Eleanor a thick leather book. It was not a prayer book. It was a banking ledger from the capital city. Eleanor opened the ledger to a marked page. I did not merely investigate your manners last night, Chloe. I investigated the state of your father's estate. Chloe crossed her arms over her chest. My family owns the largest merchant fleet in the South, she declared. Eleanor shook her head in mock sympathy. Your family owned the largest merchant fleet 10 years ago. Your father lost 3 ships to storms last winter. He lost the rest to terrible gambling debts. Chloe's arms dropped slowly to her sides. You are lying, she whispered. I never lie about money, Eleanor replied calmly. Your family estate is mortgaged to the final stone. Your father borrowed heavily from the Iron Bank to finance this wedding. He purchased your silk dress on credit. He bought your carriage with promissory notes. He intended to pay them all back using the sterling vaults. Eleanor turned the page of the heavy ledger. Unfortunately for you, the Iron Bank sells debts to private buyers. I purchased every single promissory note bearing your father's signature. I finalized the transaction at dawn this morning. Chloe stared at the ledger in absolute horror. The color drained from her face a second time. You own my family's debt, she choked out. I own your family's estate, Eleanor corrected her gently. I own the carriage waiting for you outside. I even own the horses pulling it. Your severance penalty of 50,000 gold pieces is entirely void. Your father currently owes the sterling estate 200,000 gold pieces. Chloe staggered backward and hit the stone altar. She gasped for air as the reality of her ruin set in. She had tried to conquer a kingdom and had lost her own home. You cannot do this to us, Chloe pleaded. I have already done it, Eleanor said. Eleanor gestured toward the glittering tiara on Chloe's head. Furthermore, you are wearing sterling family heirlooms. Thomas, retrieve the jewelry. Thomas approached the trembling girl. Chloe tried to shrink away from him. Thomas expertly removed the diamond tiara from her hair. He unclasped the heavy sapphire necklace from her throat. He even pulled the engagement ring from her finger. Chloe offered no physical resistance. She was completely paralyzed by the scale of her defeat. You will leave this estate exactly as you entered it, Eleanor commanded. You have no carriage. You have no funds. You will walk back to your bankrupt father on foot. James turned his back on the woman he had almost married. He walked out the side door of the chapel without a second glance. Eleanor closed the heavy leather ledger. She handed it back to Thomas. Escort the former bride to the front gates, Eleanor instructed. If she attempts to steal so much as a silver spoon, call the guards. Eleanor turned and walked down the main aisle. Her purple robes flowed behind her with absolute authority. She left Chloe kneeling in the dust of the chapel floor. The girl was stripped of her crown, her wealth, and her future. The trap had snapped shut with flawless precision. The predator had become the prey. The Dowager Duchess remained undefeated. The road away from the sterling estate was unpaved and unforgiving. Chloe felt the sharp stones bite into her bare feet with every single step. She had walked for 3 hours under the blazing afternoon sun. Her imported silk wedding gown was now a heavy, mud-soaked rag. The passing peasant carts did not offer her a ride. The drivers recognized the ruined sterling crest on her torn bodice and spat in the dirt. Word of her disgrace had already spread through the valley like wildfire. Eleanor had clearly ensured that the entire province knew of her humiliating downfall. Chloe's muscles screamed in physical agony, but a burning hatred kept her moving forward. She was not entirely out of options just yet. 5 miles down the road lay the sprawling manor of Baron Julian. Julian had been her most devoted suitor before Duke James entered the picture. He had begged for her hand in marriage only 6 months ago. Chloe had kept him tethered to her with sweet letters and false promises. She knew Julian was deeply jealous of the Sterling family's absolute power. He would surely welcome the chance to shelter a wronged and beautiful bride. He would gladly pay her father's debts just to spite his powerful rival. Chloe finally reached the iron gates of Julian's estate as the sun began to set. The guards at the gate stared at her in absolute disbelief. "Open these gates immediately," Chloe demanded, trying to summon her old, arrogant authority. "Tell the Baron that his true love has returned to him." The guards exchanged amused glances but slowly opened the heavy iron bars. Chloe limped up the gravel driveway, leaving faint bloody footprints on the white stones. She reached the grand wooden doors just as they opened from the inside. Baron Julian stood in the entryway, holding a crystal glass of amber liquid. He was a handsome man, but his eyes were calculating and incredibly cold. "Chloe," Julian said, his voice completely devoid of the warmth she expected. "I heard a rumor that you were walking the countryside like a common beggar." Chloe pushed past the guards and reached out for his tailored velvet coat. "Julian, you must help me," she sobbed, expertly forcing tears into her eyes. "The Sterlings set a terrible trap and stole my family's entire fortune. James abandoned me at the altar over a simple, foolish misunderstanding." She looked up at him with her wide, sapphire eyes, expecting to see immediate outrage. Instead, Julian took a slow sip of his drink and stepped backward. He deliberately moved out of her reach, letting her desperate hands fall to her sides. "A misunderstanding?" Julian repeated with a dry, harsh laugh. "My spies in the capital told me a very different version of events. They said you abused the Dowager Duchess and confessed to marrying James for his money." Chloe's breath hitched in her throat as panic flared in her chest again. "They are lying to you," she screamed, her voice cracking under the strain. "You know my true heart, Julian. You know I would never do such a horrible thing." Julian shook his head slowly, a deep sneer forming on his lips. "I know your heart perfectly well, Chloe. It is exactly as hollow and greedy as my own." He snapped his fingers sharply, and a servant stepped forward with a silver tray. On the tray rested a stack of official parchment documents bearing the royal seal. "Do you know what these are?" Julian asked, tapping the thick papers. Chloe stared at the documents, a terrible sinking feeling gripping her stomach. "The Dowager Duchess sent a messenger to my estate 2 hours ago," Julian explained. "She offered to sell me the northern trade routes at a massive, unprecedented discount. The only condition of the contract was that I permanently close my doors to you." Chloe stumbled backward as if he had physically struck her across the face. "You sold me out for a trade route," she whispered in absolute horror. "I sold you out for a very profitable trade route," Julian corrected her smoothly. "You cast me aside for the Duke when you thought he was the better prize. Did you honestly think I would risk a financial war with the Sterlings for your ruined reputation? My estate cannot afford to absorb your father's crippling, massive debts. I am a businessman, first and foremost, my dear. You are a terrible investment." Chloe felt her vision blur with tears of real, unbridled rage and profound humiliation. "I am still the most beautiful woman in this province," she screamed wildly. Julian laughed aloud, a cruel sound that cut through the damp evening air. "Beauty is entirely useless when it is attached to a mountain of bad debt. Look at yourself right now, Chloe. You are covered in mud, Your dress is destroyed, and you smell of cheap tavern wine. You are no longer a prize to be won. You are a walking disaster. Julian turned his back on her and gestured sharply to the armed guards. Remove this trespassing vagrant from my property at once. If she resists, throw her in the hound kennels for the night. Two heavy, armored hands grabbed Chloe roughly by the shoulders. She fought back wildly, scratching and kicking at the indifferent men. Julian, you coward, she shrieked as they dragged her down the gravel path. I will destroy you. I will destroy all of you. The heavy iron gates slammed shut in her face, completely cutting off her hysterical threats. Chloe collapsed into the muddy ditch beside the main road. The dark sky finally broke open, unleashing a torrent of freezing, violent rain. She curled into a tight ball, shivering uncontrollably as the water soaked her to the bone. She had absolutely nothing left in the world. Her father was ruined, her allies had betrayed her, and her name was pure poison. As she lay weeping in the mud, a massive dark carriage pulled to a stop beside her. It was not a sterling carriage, nor did it bear the crest of any known local nobility. The polished wood was painted pitch black, and the massive horses breathed heavy streams of white mist. The heavy carriage door swung open with a slow, deeply ominous creak. A tall man stepped out into the freezing rain, holding a silver-tipped cane. His face was hidden entirely by a deep, thick crimson hood. You have fallen very far, little bird, a smooth, incredibly dangerous voice echoed in the dark. Chloe scrambled backward in the mud, staring up at the mysterious stranger in terror. Who are you? She choked out, her teeth chattering violently. I am a man who deeply despises the Sterling family, the stranger replied calmly. The Sterlings have ruled this region with their insufferable arrogance for far too long. Eleanor thinks she is completely untouchable in her stone fortress. James thinks his noble blood protects him from the shadows. They are both completely wrong. The stranger took a step closer, indifferent to the driving rain. I possess resources that far exceed the vast wealth of the Iron Bank. I possess knowledge of ancient forces that the Church forbade centuries ago. I can give you a new face, a new name, and a new fortune. I can place you right back inside the heavily guarded walls of the Sterling Manor. He extended a black-gloved hand toward her trembling, pathetic form. But the price will not be paid in gold, Chloe. The price will be your complete and absolute obedience to my cause. You will become my deadly weapon against the Duke and his formidable mother. Chloe looked at the offered hand, her sapphire eyes hardening in the intense darkness. She felt a dark, thrilling surge of pure adrenaline replace her freezing despair. She no longer cared about honor, or dignity, or the salvation of her own soul. She only wanted to see Eleanor and James bleed for what they had done to her. Without a single moment of hesitation, Chloe reached out and took the stranger's hand. 6 months passed since the disastrous morning in the chapel. The royal palace hosted its highly anticipated winter masquerade. 1,000 thick candles cast dancing shadows across the grand ballroom. The nobility of 5 provinces gathered to celebrate the turning of the season. Duke James stood silently near the grand stone fireplace. He looked much older and far colder than he had half a year ago. He had not looked at another woman since the day he cancelled his wedding. Duty and the expansion of his territory were his only remaining passions. Dowager Duchess Eleanor watched her son from a raised velvet balcony. She sipped spiced wine slowly from a silver chalice. She entirely approved of his new, hardened demeanor. Suddenly, the master of ceremonies struck his heavy staff against the marble floor. Presenting Lady Victoria, Dowager Countess of the Obsidian Isles, the herald announced loudly. The orchestra music completely stopped. Every face in the massive ballroom turned toward the grand staircase. A solitary woman stood at the top of the marble steps. She wore a gown of deep, blood-red silk. Her hair was a waterfall of unnatural, perfect black. A delicate mask of spun gold and rubies concealed the upper half of her face. She moved with the lethal, mesmerizing grace of a hunting panther. The lords and ladies of the court whispered aggressively behind their feathered fans. No one had ever seen the Dowager Countess of the Obsidian Isles before tonight. Her sudden appearance was an orchestrated, brilliant shock to the established order. The crowd parted instantly in absolute silence as she walked across the floor. She did not look at the other dukes or the wealthy merchants. She walked a straight, deliberate line directly toward Duke James. James set his crystal glass down on a nearby table. He felt a strange, electric tension grip the air around him. The woman stopped exactly 2 feet in front of the Duke. "They say the Duke of Stirling no longer dances," she said. Her voice was a low, smoky whisper. It was completely different from the sweet, high-pitched James remembered from his past. "Rumors are often vastly exaggerated, my lady," James replied. He extended his white-gloved hand toward the stranger. "May I have the honor of this waltz?" The woman placed her gloved hand in his. Her fingers felt like pure ice through the fabric. James led her to the center of the floor as the orchestra resumed playing. They moved together in perfect, seamless rhythm. "You do not seem like a man prone to celebration, Your Grace," Victoria murmured. James kept his gaze fixed on the visible lower half of her face. "I recently learned that celebration often masks terrible betrayal," he answered flatly. Victoria let out a soft, dark laugh. "A harsh lesson, but an entirely necessary one. The world is full of beautiful, treacherous things." James felt a sudden, inexplicable shiver run heavily down his spine. He looked deeply into the dark eye holes of her ruby mask. He thought he saw a flash of sapphire blue beneath the shadows. The color immediately triggered a buried, highly painful memory. He pushed the thought away with violent mental force. His former bride was a ruined beggar with spun gold hair. This woman was a dark, commanding queen of high society. During the waltz, Victoria leaned closer to James's ear. "You hold yourself like a man expecting a knife in the back," she whispered. James tightened his grip slightly on her slim waist. "A smart man never turns his back to the dark," he countered. "But the dark is exactly where the most interesting games are played," she replied. The scent of her perfume was intoxicating and entirely foreign. It smelled of crushed dark orchids and burning copper. It completely masked the faint, lingering scent of muddy roads and tavern wine. The magic of her new master was incredibly thorough. But dark magic could never completely erase human muscle memory. High above the dance floor, Eleanor leaned forward against the balcony railing. Her sharp eyes tracked every single movement of the mysterious woman in red. Eleanor did not care about the black hair or the expensive mask. She did not care about the sudden appearance of a foreign title. Eleanor was an undisputed master of studying human mechanics. She watched the way Victoria held her left shoulder slightly higher than her right. She noticed the specific, arrogant tilt of the woman's chin when she turned corners. She saw the way the woman impatiently tapped her index finger against James's shoulder. It was a very specific, highly demanding rhythm. It was the exact same rhythm Chloe had used when ordering the terrified servants in the parlor. Eleanor set her silver chalice down with a sharp, metallic clink. Her heart rate remained perfectly steady in her chest. The dead had apparently decided to rise from their muddy graves. The little bankrupt girl had somehow found a very powerful, very dangerous backer. Eleanor smiled her terrifying, predatory smile in the darkness of the balcony. The game was no longer about simple debt and ruined reputations. This was now a war for the very survival of the Stirling bloodline. Eleanor turned her head toward her loyal steward, Thomas. "Send our fastest riders to the Obsidian Isles tonight," Eleanor whispered. "I want to know exactly whose grave this Lady Victoria crawled out of." Thomas nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the dancing couple below. She is wearing a king's ransom in rubies, my lady, Thomas noted quietly. Yes, Eleanor agreed, her eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. And whoever purchased those rubies expects a massive return on their investment. They want to use her to break our family from the inside out. They assume James is still vulnerable to a beautiful face. They also assume I am too old to see through a simple parlor trick. Eleanor stood up gracefully from her velvet chair. Prepare my carriage immediately, Thomas. I must visit the High Bishop before the sun rises. We are going to need full access to the Forbidden Church archives. We are hunting a demon tonight. The midnight bells echoed heavily across the sleeping capital city. Dowager Duchess Eleanor walked down the spiraling stone stairs of the royal cathedral. Thomas held a heavy iron lantern to light her dangerous path. The High Bishop led them deep into the forbidden catacombs. Dust fell from the vaulted stone ceiling with every single step. They reached a massive iron door covered in ancient, rusted locks. The bishop produced an iron ring of heavy skeleton keys. He unlocked the door with a loud, protesting screech of metal. The church sealed these archives 3 centuries ago, Duchess, the bishop whispered nervously. Desperate times require access to dangerous knowledge, Eleanor replied coldly. She stepped straight into the windowless, damp vault. Rows of decaying leather books lined the endless stone shelves. Eleanor approached the central reading table without hesitation. I am looking for a man who wears a crimson hood, she stated. He grants new identities to desperate souls in exchange for absolute obedience. The bishop crossed himself quickly at the terrifying description. He pulled a heavy, iron-bound ledger from the lowest shelf. He slammed it onto the table, sending up a cloud of thick dust. You speak of the blood-pact heresy, the bishop explained. He turned the brittle parchment pages with extreme caution. The man you describe is likely the disgraced Lord Silas. He was excommunicated and banished 50 years ago for his crimes. He uses dark magic to bind broken, desperate souls to his twisted will. Eleanor leaned forward to study the strange, jagged symbols on the page. How does he maintain the physical disguise of his human puppets? She asked. The bishop pointed a shaking, wrinkled finger at a faded ink drawing. The drawing depicted a large, teardrop-shaped black gemstone. The illusion is anchored directly to an object of power, the bishop read aloud. It is usually an amulet of dark obsidian worn directly against the skin. If the amulet is removed or destroyed, the entire illusion shatters completely. Eleanor smiled a grim, deeply satisfied smile in the dim lantern light. She had noticed the heavy ruby and obsidian choker around Victoria's neck during the ball. Thank you, Bishop, Eleanor said, turning swiftly toward the stairs. I have a very important dinner party to plan. Meanwhile, the morning sun illuminated the vast rose gardens of the Sterling estate. Chloe walked slowly and deliberately beside Duke James. She still wore her flawless, dark disguise as Lady Victoria. Her expensive silk dress brushed against the blooming white roses. She held an intricate parchment scroll tightly in her gloved hands. It was a trade agreement drafted by Lord Silas himself. The contract appeared highly profitable for the Sterling family on the surface. In reality, it contained hidden clauses designed to legally drain the Sterling vaults within 2 years. The Obsidian Isles offer resources your kingdom desperately needs, Chloe murmured. She pitched her voice to a seductive, hypnotic frequency. She stepped slightly closer to James, letting her dark perfume surround him completely. James kept his hands folded firmly behind his back. He had received a coded message from his mother at dawn. The message simply read, "The dead bride dances in red. Trust nothing." James looked down at the mysterious, beautiful woman beside him. He finally noticed the heavy obsidian pendant resting against her pale collarbone. It pulsed with a very faint, entirely unnatural heat. Your proposal is certainly intriguing, Lady Victoria," James said smoothly. He did not back away from her calculated, predatory advance. He played the part of the interested, slightly foolish nobleman perfectly. Chloe felt a sudden surge of arrogant triumph in her chest. She completely believed her dark magic was overriding his natural senses. "If your grace signs this treaty today, we can begin our partnership immediately," she pressed. She held the parchment scroll out to him with a confident, winning smile. Before James could reach for the document, a sharp voice cut through the silent garden. "My son signs absolutely nothing without my seal of approval." Chloe stiffened instantly and turned around slowly. Eleanor stood at the entrance to the rose garden. She wore her signature purple riding habit and carried her silver cane. She looked exactly as formidable as a stone fortress wall. Chloe forced a polite, entirely fake smile onto her masked face. "Dowager Duchess," Chloe greeted, bowing her head in mock respect. "I was just discussing maritime commerce with the Duke." Eleanor walked deliberately down the white gravel path. She stopped mere inches from the disguised girl. Eleanor's sharp eyes locked immediately onto the black obsidian pendant. "Maritime commerce is such a terribly dry subject for a beautiful morning," Eleanor said. Her voice dripped with lethal, knowing sarcasm. "We should discuss your future over a private dinner instead." Chloe felt a cold spike of pure panic pierce her unnatural confidence. She recognized the dangerous gleam in the older woman's eyes. It was the exact same look Eleanor had given her right before the ruined shoes were presented at the altar. "I am afraid my schedule is quite full, Your Grace," Chloe lied quickly. "Nonsense," Eleanor replied, her tone leaving absolutely no room for refusal. "I insist you dine with us tonight in the main family hall. I have prepared a very special, very traditional menu just for you." Eleanor reached out with surgical precision. She lightly tapped the obsidian pendant with the tip of her silver cane. "Do make sure to wear this beautiful necklace tonight. It ties your whole appearance together so perfectly." Eleanor turned her back and walked away without waiting for an answer. Chloe clutched the parchment scroll until her knuckles turned entirely white. She realized she could not run away without instantly exposing her guilt. Lord Silas would kill her himself if she failed this critical mission. She had absolutely no choice but to walk directly into the jaws of the beast. James offered his arm to the frozen, terrified girl. "Shall I escort you to the guest wing to prepare, Lady Victoria?" he asked politely. Chloe stared after the departing Duchess, a sickening realization washing over her. The ultimate trap was completely set. She was already standing directly in the center of it. James smiled a cold, heavily practiced smile. "I look forward to seeing the real you tonight," he whispered. The grand dining hall of the Sterling estate was lit by 100 wax candles. The long mahogany table was set for exactly 3 people. Dowager Duchess Eleanor sat at the absolute head of the table. Duke James sat to her right. Lady Victoria was placed deliberately at the opposite end. The physical distance made the young woman feel entirely isolated. Chloe picked up her heavy silver fork with trembling fingers. She could feel the cold, heavy weight of the obsidian pendant against her skin. It was her only shield against utter destruction. "The roasted duck is a local specialty, Lady Victoria," Eleanor said smoothly. "We source the meat directly from our southern tenant farms. Our farmers are very loyal, hard-working people." Chloe forced a small piece of meat past her tight throat. "It is absolutely delicious, Your Grace," she lied seamlessly. "I must say, we do not have such delicacies on the Obsidian Isles. Our island soil is unfortunately quite poor for farming." Eleanor set her silver wine goblet down on the pristine white tablecloth. "Oh, I am fully aware of the local soil on the Obsidian Isles. The island is essentially a barren rock in the middle of a freezing sea. They eat salted fish and extremely tough sea birds. They certainly do not produce the fine red silk you are currently wearing. Chloe froze instantly in her high-backed wooden chair. You have visited my homeland? She asked, her voice faltering slightly. Eleanor smiled her terrifying, predator's smile. I know every inch of this kingdom and its surrounding territories. I also know the royal lineage of every single noble house. The actual ruling family of the Obsidian Isles died out 40 years ago. The last countess was buried in a stone tomb before you were even born. The silence in the grand dining room became absolutely suffocating. James leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms over his chest. He watched the disguised woman with cold, unblinking eyes. Mother is a very thorough historian, Victoria, James noted quietly. She never misses a single detail. Chloe's heart hammered violently against her ribs. She pushed her chair back from the heavy mahogany table. I feel suddenly unwell, Chloe stammered, grabbing her silk napkin. I believe the journey has finally caught up with my constitution. I must return to my guest chambers immediately. She stood up and turned quickly toward the heavy oak doors. Sit back down, Eleanor commanded. The voice was not a polite request. It was the absolute roar of a ruling monarch. 2 armored guards immediately stepped out from the shadows of the doorway. They blocked the only exit with drawn steel swords. Chloe slowly backed away from the dangerous, sharp blades. She retreated until her back hit the edge of the dining table. What is the meaning of this outrage? She screamed, feigning aristocratic anger. I am a noble guest in this house. I demand to be treated with proper respect. You are an intruder in my home, Eleanor corrected her sharply. Eleanor stood up and picked up her heavy silver-tipped cane. She walked slowly down the length of the long dining table. Every step echoed like a death knell in the quiet room. You made a deal with a banished heretic named Lord Silas. Chloe let out a sharp, panicked gasp. The mention of the Dark Lord's name shattered her remaining composure. He gave you a new face and a new name. He sent you here to drain our family vaults with a forged trade treaty. He completely underestimated my intelligence. James stood up and walked toward the terrified woman. You thought I was still a blind, lovesick fool, James said coldly. You thought I would sign away my birthright for a pretty smile. You were wrong about me the first time, and you are wrong now. Chloe reached up and desperately clutched the black obsidian pendant. You have absolutely no proof of these insane accusations, she cried. I will report this insult to the royal court. Eleanor stopped right in front of the trembling girl. I never make an accusation without physical proof. Eleanor moved with startling, terrifying speed for a woman of her age. She swung her heavy silver cane upward in a vicious, calculated arc. The solid silver tip struck the black obsidian pendant dead center. A loud, unnatural cracking sound filled the entire dining hall. The black gemstone shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Dark, foul-smelling smoke erupted instantly from the broken shards. Chloe let out a blood-curdling scream of pure agony. She fell hard to her knees on the polished wooden floor. The dark magic began to unravel violently around her entire body. The perfect raven hair rapidly drained of its unnatural color. It faded back to a dirty, ruined spun gold blonde. The expensive blood-red silk gown dissolved into thick gray ash. Underneath the illusion, she still wore her mud-soaked, torn wedding dress. The ruby mask cracked completely in half and fell from her face. The beautiful, mysterious Lady Victoria vanished entirely into thin air. Only Chloe remained kneeling in the dirt and ash. She was exactly the same ruined beggar Julian had thrown into the ditch. James looked down at his former bride with absolute, icy disgust. Hello again, Chloe, James said softly. Chloe covered her face with her filthy, shaking hands. She wept with the total despair of a completely broken woman. The grand illusion was permanently destroyed. she had tried to play a dangerous game against the Dowager Duchess. She had lost absolutely everything in the process. Eleanor looked down at the weeping girl with a face carved from stone. "Guards," Eleanor called out clearly. "Take this trespassing thief down to the deepest dungeon cells. We will decide her final fate in the morning." The heavy steel boots of the guards marched quickly across the floor. They grabbed her by the arms and dragged her away. Her hysterical sobbing faded into the darkness of the manor corridors. Eleanor turned back to her son and offered a small, proud smile. The main course was somewhat dramatic, Eleanor noted calmly. But the dessert should be quite peaceful. The damp stone walls of the deepest Stirling dungeon offered no comfort to the ruined prisoner. Duke James stood in the narrow stone corridor. His tall, heavily muscled frame completely dominated the small space. The flickering wall torches cast harsh shadows across his sharp jawline and perfectly trimmed short hair. He looked through the heavy iron bars at the woman huddled in the corner of the cell. Chloe wore the exact same ruined, mud-stained wedding dress she had arrived in. Her spun gold hair was matted with dirt and grey ash. It was a pathetic, lingering reminder of her shattered magical disguise. She did not dare to look up when his heavy boots finally stopped outside her cell door. "The royal magistrates signed the official decree today," James stated. His voice was completely devoid of any lingering affection or pity. "Your crimes against our noble house and your illegal pact with a banished heretic demand the ultimate penalty. You will not face the executioner's block, Chloe. My mother and I have decided on a far more fitting punishment for your immense greed and breathtaking arrogance." Chloe slowly lifted her face. Her sapphire eyes were hollow and completely broken. She opened her cracked lips, but no sound emerged. She knew her fate was entirely sealed the moment the black obsidian pendant shattered in the dining hall. "You once boasted about your grand plan to banish the Dowager Duchess to a drafty, isolated convent," James continued. His dark eyes remained entirely merciless as he stared at the trembling girl. "You thought it was a brilliant way to dispose of the woman who built this empire. Therefore, we are granting your wish, albeit with a slight change in the final recipient. You are being permanently exiled to the Sisters of the Silent Stone. It is a penal monastery located on the furthest northern border, surrounded by freezing winds and barren rocks. You will spend the rest of your natural life scrubbing stone floors and washing coarse linen in absolute silence. You will never wear imported silk again. You will never taste fine wine again. You will simply fade away into complete obscurity." A choked, agonizing sob finally escaped Chloe's throat. She crawled desperately across the damp floor toward the iron bars. She reached her filthy hands out toward the Duke, trying to grasp his polished boots. She wanted to beg for mercy, but the cold, impenetrable wall of his rigid posture stopped her entirely. He was a sovereign lord who had learned the absolute hardest lesson about treachery. His heart was now locked securely away behind steel and solemn duty. "Take her to the prisoner transport carriage immediately," James commanded the waiting guards without looking back. "And ensure she walks the entire distance to the courtyard barefoot." Meanwhile, high above the dismal dungeons, Dowager Duchess Eleanor sat comfortably in her sunlit private study. She wore a deep crimson velvet morning gown and held a delicate porcelain teacup. Thomas the steward entered the room, carrying a heavy silver tray laden with fresh correspondence. He bowed deeply before approaching her polished mahogany desk. "The final reports have arrived from the capital city, my lady," Thomas announced. His tone reflected deep, profound satisfaction. "Your swift financial maneuvers were entirely successful. Lord Silas has been permanently neutralized." Eleanor took a slow, elegant sip of her hot tea. "Detail the execution of the plan, Thomas. I want to know exactly how the arrogant heretic finally fell. When you recognized the dark magic signature on the false countess, you instantly anticipated the source," Thomas explained. He unrolled the sealed parchment and read the contents aloud. You authorized the immediate transfer of 300,000 gold pieces to the mercenary guild protecting Lord Silas in the shadows. You essentially bought his entire private army out from under him. When Silas attempted to flee his hidden sanctuary upon sensing the destruction of the obsidian amulet, his own guards blocked his path. They seized his dark artifacts, burned his blasphemous ledgers to ashes, and handed him directly over to the high inquisitors of the royal church. Eleanor smiled her terrifying, triumphant smile. She set her teacup down gently on its matching saucer. Silas believed he could use the sterling wealth to fund his dark rebellion. He fundamentally misunderstood the true nature of power. Magic is merely a tool, Thomas. True, absolute power lies in the heavy gold vaults and the unwavering iron will to use them. He is currently rotting in a church cell awaiting public trial, Thomas added with a grim nod. The threat against your bloodline has been eradicated completely. The nobles of the 5 provinces are terrified of your sheer efficiency. No one will ever dare challenge the sterling name again. James entered the study, his heavy footsteps announcing his arrival. He walked over to the grand window and looked out over the sprawling, prosperous lands of their massive estate. The rain had finally stopped. The bright morning sun illuminated the endless green valleys and distant, snow-capped mountains. The prison carriage has departed for the northern border, James said quietly. The girl is gone forever. The estate is secure. Eleanor stood up and walked over to her tall, powerful son. She reached out and placed a steadying hand on his broad shoulder. He had survived the ultimate betrayal and emerged stronger, colder, and infinitely more capable of ruling their vast empire. You have done extremely well, James, Eleanor murmured. Her voice carried the immense weight of their victorious legacy. You have learned that a crown is not kept safe by trusting pretty words. It is kept safe by striking down your enemies with overwhelming, absolute force. James looked down at his mother. A fierce, undeniable pride burned brightly in his eyes. The age of foolish, vulnerable love was permanently over. The reign of the Iron Duke and his terrifying mother had officially begun, and their empire would stand absolutely invincible for 1,000 years. Chloe intended to banish her mother-in-law, yet ultimately ended up consigning herself to a convent of eternal silence. Some say Duke James was ruthless, that he personally destroyed the woman he once loved. Others argue that this was the perfect, karmic retribution for a greedy soul. If you were James, in that moment when you saw Chloe kneeling in the mud, begging for mercy, would you choose to show one final act of kindness, or would you, like him, seal off your heart completely? Leave a comment and share your choice. Want to see more plot twists featuring strong female leads who take absolute control of the situation? Hit that follow button so you don't miss out.